Hello everyone, Chiori got some updates and my mind is still shocked about Hoyoverse's thought process and some of these things that they're doing, especially what was revealed most recently. Before we get into that however, I'm going to quickly go over the various other changes with Chiori that I didn't get to cover in my first video about her. Nothing drastically changed about her overall kit, strength, builds, and team so far, so if you are looking for a general overview and analysis about Chiori, I recommend checking out my first video first. But anyways, let's quickly go over the changes. Her signature was buffed so that she gets the normal charge attack buff and skill damage buff unconditionally, so that's cool. Her skill into skill follow-up attack that makes you swap characters may now be skill into spacebar. I'm actually not too sure about this change as it hasn't been confirmed, but I'll just mention it here just in case. Her C2 and her C4 were swapped. Her C6 scaling on normal text was changed to only defense, but the interesting thing is that they removed the 5-hit limit that a typical Yelan and Farina C6 has, so this is a huge push and a buff for C6 Chiori as just a pure on-field carry. Sounds cool for a C6, I like constellations that change playstyle, but still a C6 that very little people will get. The most impactful older change already documented was that Chiori's dolls no longer snapshot any stat, when previously it was reported to have snapshotted defense. I already mentioned my thoughts on snapshotting in the original video, but I'll reiterate my thoughts again. Yes, not snapshotting will decrease Chiori's overall doll damage since you can't have the dolls take full advantage of, let's say, Goro's defense buffs. But it may or may not be a nerf in overall team DPS because if Chiori can't snapshot, you'll use Goro's buffs after Chiori's setup, leaving more time for your on-fielder, for instance Ito, to take advantage of Goro's buff and increase his DPS. Now whether or not this is better than snapshotting Chiori's dolls, I'm not too sure, I haven't seen any calcs on it, and the answer will heavily depend on Chiori and your on-fielder's investment. But because of this, I don't think Chiori being able or not being able to snapshot her dolls matters too much. Now lastly, the most recent change that is causing a lot of discourse. Chiori's ultimate energy cost decreased by 10, the cooldown was decreased by 1.5 seconds, and the ult multiplier was significantly decreased. Now if you have like C2, C4, and especially C6 where you're more incentivized to on-field Chiori and ult to get more simple dolls to spawn, then sure, this is a buff, but if we consider Chiori as a sub DPS, which will be the majority of people, C0, C1, then in most cases, it's a nerf. Chiori's lower ult cooldown doesn't matter because rotations will always be made around the on-fielder and buff uptime, which is like around 20 seconds for most teams. And even if you do get to theoretically ult more, there still is the energy recharge issue. Now there was a particle ICD change from 1.9 seconds to 3 seconds that at first glance looks like a nerf on her particle generation, but since her dolls hit every 3.6 seconds, it ultimately doesn't change anything drastically in terms of her overall energy generation. So the only thing that really matters is the cost change from 60 to 50. With the original numbers, people were calculating Chiori's damage assuming one ult every other rotation, which is like 20 seconds. So in order for the current ult to not just be a strict significant multiplier nerf, you would have to be able to ult every rotation. Now I think in a pure practical sense, where your best artifacts may happen to just have a good amount of ER, you might be able to pull this off in practice. And in these cases, the overall ult change may be a buff to your specific Chiori if you do happen to have the stats for it. But I think that in a vacuum and in most people's scenarios, having the ult be 50 energy still has a relatively high ER requirement, and it just isn't worth forcing ER into a build when you can just buff the doll damage with building more defense, attack, or more crit. And speaking of the doll damage, remember that the skill damage is the majority of Chiori's damage, not the ult. So all this talk about her ult changes being an overall nerf in most cases, it ultimately doesn't really affect her overall strength. She's still a better albedo, she's still a buff to Ito teams, and she's still a slight buff to Navia teams. But the thing that really boggles my mind about all of this is, why are Hoyoverse making all these changes? Like, why are we giving nerfs even though they only have a small overall effect to a character whose main selling point is just being better than Albedo, who's one of the worst limited 5-stars in the game? Why are we being so conservative in the power level of a Geo sub DPS character, whose element and teams are struggling quite significantly when compared to the rest of the elements and a lot of other teams? It just doesn't make sense to me. Like, I think Chiori is decent in the context of Geo teams, but when considering all the other teams you can play, I don't think Chiori being Albedo's upgrade is good enough. There's a reason why Geo teams are already subbing in characters like Bennett and Yelan. Geo teams and the characters definitely deserve more buffs to increase their team DPS. You could increase Chiori's damage outright, or just give Chiori a party-wide Geo damage buff, but a nerf? Like, obviously the nerf itself is pretty inconsequential, but it's the direction that Hoyoverse is taking with this change that really worries me. what's stopping them from making her stronger? Like, in comparison, even with Xianyun's removal of grouping that happened during the beta, they compensated by buffing the most important part of her kit twice. Personally, I don't like making conclusions based on vague patterns, but I'm quite concerned that this supposed 0.5 patch curse is coming true. Patch 1.5 had Eula, which if you compare to other 5-star DPS characters, she is an overall average to below average DPS for most people. 2.5 had Yai, which currently I think is the exception to this supposed curse, but only because of the release of Dendro. And patch 3.5 had the release of Dea, which needs no explanation. So I really hope Chiori doesn't fall completely in line with this supposed pattern and expectation. There is plenty of time left, so Chiori could just get buffed really easily, but if I see another nerf next week, then I don't know what Hoyoverse are smoking. That's everything I wanted to cover. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment, leave a video a like, and subscribe if you like these kinds of updates and analysis on upcoming characters, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.